Hello everyone, and welcome back to week 7 of UX Design Fundamentals, where we'll tackle the surface plane. Let's get started, shall we? Before we get into the surface plane, just a quick review of the final homework assignment that is due in just about 1 week's time. Your homework assignment entails creating a wireframe for VisoCast's navigation. We'll need you to do a wireframe of navigation for desktop, including the global navigation, perhaps a courtesy nav, maybe a footer navigation. Whatever makes sense for you and the research that you did in the card sort assignment. Also, you'll need to recreate the mobile version of that same information architecture. A mobile menu with a static version of the homepage and an off-canvas menu, and include the footer there as well if you do that in desktop. Just as a reminder, a wireframe is a visual guide that represents the skeletal framework of a website, focusing on priority, hierarchy, and structure. Also, in case it's helpful, here's a little screenshot of what our expectations are for a wireframe. Hopefully, this helps guide you on your path. The surface plane. At the top of the 5-plane model, we turn our attention to those aspects of the product our users will notice first, the sensory design. We're finally here at the top of our 5 planes of user experience. We started with strategy, where we determined user needs and product objectives. We layered on a definition of scope, where we put together the details of our functional specifications and content requirements. Then, armed with the strategy and scope outputs, we created a structure that represented how our users would get from one place to another in our experience. In the 4th plane, we looked at skeleton, and for the last 2 weeks we've been talking about how to materialize strategy, scope, and structure into a deliverable we call wireframes in the skeleton plane. Now we take it to the next level and apply your client's brand to the experiences that we've been working on for the last 5 weeks. In the surface plane, we experience sensory design. Leading up to this point, we've been looking at a blueprint of what could be. But now we have the ability to apply feeling, emotion, engagement through brand assets like color, typography, contrast, photography, and other content. Everything we do in the surface plane is meant to enhance the experience and create a memorable, engaging one for all of our users. When defining the surface, visual design rules the product. Much of our current interface patterns are derived from industrial design. Because of our familiarity with industrial design, most of the patterns that we use in the digital space take root there. This allows for our sensory design to feel a little bit closer to home. Things we can take advantage of in this plane, however, are touch, interaction, and device capabilities. It allows us to expand our canvas as designers. When we define the surface, visual design takes lead from benchmarks and starts with analysis through some specific lenses. Firstly, we like to look at the competitive landscape. I don't think I know any clients that don't observe and record what their competitors are doing on a regular basis. Keeping track of your competition allows you to stay ahead. We also look at current best practices. What's happening in the world of digital design? What are people considering the best of the best? And when we evaluate the approach to visual design, we also look at emerging trends. Depending on what type of brand you're working with, looking at emerging trends might be right up their alley. But be cautious of the cool factor. Trends are trends for a reason, and they may only be temporary. Don't get led astray by a trend that may not stick around. But even though competitive landscape, best practices, and emerging trends lead our visual design decisions, design standards still apply. And what we'll be looking at in the surface plane is what are those standards and how can we abide by them. Ultimately, your job is to ensure that visual design contributes to the experience. Up to this point, you've spent a lot of time making the right decisions in the right steps. This is that last final moment where you apply brand to wireframes and get ready for prime time. When we evaluate visual design, here are some approaches. Design research is always great. I already mentioned competitive analysis in the previous slide. Design research similarly looks at competitors, but also looks at parallel industries, subject matter areas that may be relative in nature. For example, if I were working on a grocery website, I may look at other grocery websites, but also I may look at quick service restaurants or fast food delivery services. Those will have parallels that people would expect, and users look to the next greatest thing when comparing your experience to others. When we evaluate visual design practices, we should also look closely at accepted conventions. An accepted convention is the most common way of doing a specific thing. That's the way that most people understand and interpret the way to process information. If you break away from accepted conventions, there's a risk that users will have to teach themselves how to use your interface. So it's always best to start by examining what accepted conventions are in the specific industry that you're working within. And as we mentioned before, best practices should be followed as much as possible when evaluating visual design. Determine your methodology by making sure you're very familiar with what best practices are in your subject matter. And what are the pros and cons of each? Is it better to stick with accepted conventions, best practices, or take lead from some of the design research? Well, the answer really is a combination of all three. I don't think there's any right answer to sticking with one versus the other. What you have to do is contemplate what your design needs and balance that against what your user wants and your product objectives are. That should help you determine what you utilize from your visual design evaluation. Now I'm going to take you on a little ride of good design or bad design. This is an exercise that I'll want you to do on your own right after this module. But I'll walk you through a couple of the visuals. Please take the time to review this again and make note on each screen that we show. Tell me a little bit about whether it's good or bad design, and give me a few points to rationalize your decision. Let's get started on this one, shall we? Of course, here's my favorite website, the world's worst website ever. It can be found at theworldsworstwebsiteever.com if you don't remember. Tell me whether this is good design or bad design. Now, just to clarify, the question isn't whether this is good UX or bad UX. Because as we all know, good UX occurs at the juxtaposition of user needs and product objectives. What are the user needs of the world's worst website ever? And on the flip side, what are the product objectives? That being said, your evaluation isn't an experience critique. In this case, I'm purely asking whether this is good design or bad design. Is this good design or bad design? And tell me why. Is this Apple website from many years ago good design or bad design? And juxtapose that against Apple today. Does this change your opinion? Next, tell me about this Volkswagen website from a number of years ago. Good design or bad design? And similarly, juxtapose that against the newer version of the same URL. Good design or bad design? What about Google? Good design or bad design? And finally, the never-ending debate. Good design or bad design? Which one is better and why? And we'll round out the exercise with that eternal question of Mac versus Windows. We're going to pause there and end this module, and we'll see you in the next one.